Welcome back, guys, to the Beyond Condition podcast. Now, we have a returning guest. Dynamite himself has come on the pod for a second time. So thank you, first of all, for coming on, David.
Thanks for having me back on again. It was a blast last time, and I feel like people actually took away some stuff. I was tagging a lot of stories, and I was like, oh, I'm glad you guys are taking some stuff away. I was like, I'm very opinionated and passionate on the subject.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, because, of course, the title of this episode in particular is going to be My First Cycle. And I'm sure you're going to agree with me as well, David, when you see that title and you think, okay, I'll listen to this podcast. This is going to tell me how to construct my first cycle. And that's not what this episode is going to be about. It's actually about sharing some anecdote and considerations before you even look at that. And I know we mentioned it before, we are both advocates of exploring your natural potential first. There are cases where, of course, maybe you jump straight in, but generally it's a sport where you want to give it a go first.
Yeah, I love the way that you just said that. And I've actually been on, like, Broderick and I have been doing a lot of collaborations lately. And Broderick, I consider actually the #1 PED expert in the world. And I'm probably the only person outside of anywhere that he does collaborations with. Like, he's very opinionated in his thoughts, as well as particular about who he'll collaborate with. And we're just like very synergistic as far as like personality goes. Like, we just have a good time and roll. And he actually doesn't like the term cycle, and I do agree with him. And why don't I agree with the terminology cycling? Well, a cycle sounds like you're on a cycle and you're constantly spinning the wheels and spinning the wheels and spinning the wheels and spinning the wheels. Well, technically it doesn't stop, right? So once you start a quote unquote cycle, he uses the term course. What is the course to get you to your goal? And when I don't even use the term, I don't like the term steroids, right? Why don't I like the course steroids? Because there's exogenous hormones, but there's also PEDs. There's a wide spectrum of PEDs, which encompasses even something like caffeine is a PED. It's a performance enhancer. So it's like, what is the best course of action to get you to your goals? And there's a lot that come into conjunction together to get you to your goals way before you even think about enhancement, because you might not even need it. You may hit a certain point and you're like, I don't want to be a professional athlete. Well, why are you going to potentially negatively impact your health on the performance enhancement side if you can just obtain amazing results without having all the negative ramifications that come into play? And this is the double lies in the details and risk versus reward. There is risk and reward involved in every aspect of life.
Yeah, for sure. I really like what you said there about steroids, because when I try and describe to sort of Gen Pop that I am an assisted athlete, if you say assisted athlete, they look at you and they don't know what the hell you're talking about. And then you try and go down the route of, it's often thrown around in the UK, I'm on gear. And it's like, that almost sounds a little bit. And then if you say I'm on steroids, they're like, oh, right, okay. And it's hard to obviously get across to, normal people, as it were, what it means.
Yeah, it really is. And a lot of it has to do with the programming that there's a really good rap group that I listen to. And one of the things is they're talking about a box sitting in the corner of the room. And that was the best thing the government ever did, because they get to program us in any way, shape, or form, whether it be a radio or a TV. It's all constant programming. Social media, constant programming. They hinder the ability on certain freedoms of speech still, because they want to get across something, and they can literally flip a switch on algorithmically to show certain content or not. And very well, we know what happened during the elections. There's lawsuits going on around it. So that just goes to show that there's certain terms that, like, it's like, boom, oh, steroids, negative. That's immediately what they think. It's like, they don't like, what about the other hormones that are like bioidentical, that are literally, actually, we have research that testosterone in a high populous risk group of heart disease reduces down the risk of heart disease. We finally have a study that shows it, which we knew from a mechanical standpoint, this actually was factual. And we actually have finally proof of this. But is this being put up on CNN and stuff like that? Probably not. Maybe, but probably not.
Yeah, for sure. And it is, you touched on there about social media, and it's something we could probably jump in with, that actually, when you're looking at being assisted using PDs, whatever we want to call it, that when you're looking on Instagram or social media and you see that highlight reel, you don't necessarily look at what's actually involved in using PDs. And I know myself, before going down this route, it's even like pinning yourself, getting PEDs, these types of things, and also storing them if you've got family members, like how you would communicate that. So there is a lot around it. And I think that people just think, oh, I'll jump on gear. And actually, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, so I was actually very ignorant when I first got started in the sport, because I went from 135 pounds naturally to 217 pounds over a course of 3-year period of time. And I would go back home like every 3 months, and my dad's like, "What are you taking?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" Like, I was so stupid when it came to any type of gear or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, like, someone sat me down one time. He goes, "You know, everyone that you look up to, like, physique wise, yeah, they're all in trend." And I was like, "What the heck is trend?" And so, and this is way before like things were openly talked about and stuff like that. Sure enough, like on my first cycle, you were talking about the ejection thing. That's why I'm thinking about it. I was scared of needles. Like I'm like the worst bodybuilder ever. I'm still technically kind of scared of needles. And when I was like, maybe my second or third shot that was being administered to me, and I was like, you know what's weird? There's literally like something like a liquid going in my body, and it's morphing me into something like I feel like an animal, and it's like crazy, like that this liquid feels like freaking liquid gold, because it just turns you into a superhuman athlete. And it literally feels like Rocky Balboa, like fighting the Russian, right? Like that's literally like actually like in relativity, at least on the first time that you're ever doing anything. But it's a very weird thing that went in my head. I was like, I'm literally putting liquid into my body right now, and it's turning me into like feeling like a freak of nature. Like I'm just morphing. Like I put on, I guess we can jump into this later on, but like I put on about 35 to 40 pounds of tissue my first cycle I ever ran, and I kept 25 to 30 pounds of it. It didn't go anywhere. Now I'm glad that my testicles rebooted quickly, because that would have went away very quickly. And I was doing everything right before that point, so I was lined up for success. And that's another thing that people forget: if you're not lined up for success, you're gonna flop, and you can actually reverse a lot of the growth that you did. And that's something I didn't realize early on, until you see these guys that blow up and shrink and blow up and shrink and blow up and shrink. I'm like, what the heck are these guys doing? And like you realize like they were quote unquote cycles. It was cycle, then off, then cycle, then off, then bridge. And it's like, oh my gosh. I was like, so this is what's going on.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, there's probably a good sort of place we could actually delve into the considerations of nailing the basics first. Now, this
Yeah.
series is about the fundamentals of bodybuilding. And again, we sort of touched on this in the first episode we did together. Actually, have you got your training, your nutrition, your sleep, your recovery? The list goes on. Have you got that managed first? And have you got your ducks in a line before you look at going down this route? I think that a lot of people, it's almost like that easy access to gains, as it were.
Yeah, and I don't even think that you should be even considering it, even though it's so widely available, the information now. Back then, it wasn't. I obviously I was lifting for 3 years, didn't even know what the word trend meant,
Yeah.
and so I didn't know everyone else was on steroids around me. I like kind of started picking up on it, because like I knew Arnold was on steroids, but it's Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's a freak of nature, right?
Yeah.
And didn't think anything of it. So when those fundamentals are in place, I think it should be minimum, and not even for younger, like younger should be even longer, because you got such a, I don't blow your wad early on is what I try to say. So take what you can do and progress. And you're going to, as a natural athlete, you feel like you hit a lot of roadblocks along the way, like, oh, I'm not making progress. But if you refer back to pictures, you're like, okay, I am making progress. You might hit plateaus a little bit easier, but when you hit plateaus and you're not enhanced, it gives you an opportunity to actually get better at the fundamentals. And if you actually master those fundamentals, the rest comes so easy later on, then, because you know how to get past plateaus. If you're hitting a plateau, you need to reanalyze the situation, because you're doing something wrong, or something else needs to be done, because you technically should not plateau, especially early on in your career. I mean, you really shouldn't plateau, in my personal opinion. If you have good genetics, like a male, 5'8" male, you shouldn't plateau until you're probably around like with good genetics, 200 plus pounds. And I'd probably say maybe some plateauing, like hard plateauing, potentially on your genetic limitations, around the 210 marker. If technically on paper, if you have superior genetics, it would be 230 pounds. And that's a genetically superior. So on paper, I guess if I kept going naturally, I would have ended up being probably considered in the genetically superior for obtaining muscle growth naturally. So that's just from a mathematical standpoint, and the math still runs parallel very similar to women as well on how good your genetics are from a mathematical standpoint. Now, is everything relative? I mean, everything's relative in practice, but not always on paper.
Yeah, well, another example of the highlight reel of social media, when you aspire to something that's maybe not achievable. I find that there's three main factors that I've come across. That you need to look at the individual sporting background. So what have they been doing from a young age? Like, massive. Then genetics, like you've touched on, and are they already assisted? Now, if you're looking at the highlight reel and going, wow, I want to look like that, I can look like that. Now, I always say, be inspired, right? Like, but you need to stay in your own lane because you are a genetic individual, of course.
Yeah, so you bring up a really good point. I bring up this all the time. So I'm going to use Lee Priest as an example, a massive genetic anomaly. Okay. When he was 20 years old, he would have been classic Mr. Olympia naturally, basically. So he was training since he was like 11 or 12 years old. He had a decade under his belt by the time he was 20 years old. But if you look at what happens in a young person's body when you're going through puberty, when you're having all these hormones, your IGF-1 levels are so high you can never replicate this probably ever again at a pharmacokinetic level. I've never seen it on paper. I've seen a 19-year-old kid one time with like a 900 IGF-1 score, and they're the guy that he walked into a clinic. This is why I hate clinics, by the way. He walked into a clinic and they're like, oh yeah, you don't need growth hormone. Like IGF-1 is what I would do, right? I'm like, let's run your labs. And I highly disagree with this statement. So he runs his labs and he's like at like a 900 plus IGF-1 score. I'm like, look, man, you can't put enough IGF-1 in your body to even obtain this level. Don't touch anything. Like there's literally no reason to do anything. And when you're young, that epigenetic component can manipulate so much in muscle hyperplasia, what sport you're in. We see predominantly track runners look amazing when it comes to bodybuilding. And it's probably the amount of fast twitch muscle fibers they're producing when they're children, and they're constantly pounding their legs over and over again and developing extra muscle hyperplasia, because when we're kids, we can do muscle hyperplasia, which is literally the creation of new muscle tissue. As adults, we do muscle hypertrophy only, pretty much, predominantly. It can still happen. That's why growth hormone comes into the equation to a degree. So yes, 100% epigenetics can change. Muscle tissue can change when you're young, and that needs to be taken into the equation because that's a massive epigenetic component. And then after that, genetics. But don't let genetics always be a limiting factor. I hate when people talk about genetics being a limiting factor. It 100% is when you're looking at the upper echelon, right? Like Derek Lunsford has like a 3-inch waist, right? It's like, it's crazy. His clavicle structure, his hip girdle, his waistline, all that stuff, his muscle inserts, absolutely genetics are a component there. And anyone that argues against that is absolutely incorrect. So Michael Phelps basically had flippers for hands and feet. Are you going to tell me that I can be a Michael Phelps? Absolutely not. I'm 5'8". I'm not 6 foot with like a wingspan of a bald eagle or something like that. It's just not, that's just not me. I'm never going to be an NBA player. So genetics do play a very important role, but epigenetics, I think when it comes to at least muscle growth and predominantly, is a massive piece to the overall structure and the tissue size over time.
Yeah, and actually, you say Michael Phelps. I always find swimmers that have done that from a young age to a good level. Gymnastics, like these are two really big contributors to a lot of high level athletes that I get on the pod or I speak to over in the UK. And also, I find you mentioned it before about track runners, the discipline and being able to push through barriers. Now, as a bodybuilder, when you're prepping, when you're off season, everything you have to do, you've got to do it yourself, right? So you can have cheerleaders, you can have people around you, but in the darkest of times, it's you that has to push through. And a lot of these athletes that have had it installed into them at a young age, they can continue, they can push through these barriers.
Yeah, the mindset factor, those moral values. And honestly, I would almost that pushing factor, that's partially, I believe it's a wiring at a very early, like a very young age. Moral values and that potential wiring is a very young age. That's probably before you even hit puberty, to be honest. However, it's like having athletic induced asthma. you can train your lungs to push through that. And that's basically that wall barrier. I actually had athletic induced asthma when I played soccer, and it took me about 6 months and I never had it again. I just kept running until I couldn't breathe. And then I'll try running for as long as I can. And then, eventually like your lungs just get strong enough and you just keep going. Right. And I was a really good runner. That being said, is absolutely those walls as an athlete, and those are the fundamental roots to an athlete. These high level athletes in other sports, when they come to bodybuilding relatively comes easily. In fact, the hardest thing about bodybuilding to me is having to eat as much food, well, at least for me, because I was a metabolic anomaly, but was eating as much food as I had to in the offseason. That was literally the hardest thing. Dieting down for me, suffering. Oh my gosh. Like, I'll just take a nap, whatever.
Yeah,
So
I
like
love
that, yeah, the internals of the sport to me are relatively easily. The externals that come around the sport are the hard things, like having the lack of energy to do things like having sex with your partner. We're going to get into the first cycles
Yeah,
anyway. So
yeah,
having sex with your partner, like, and you don't have the energy for it. You're like, oh, I'd love to do it, and my wife's horny
yeah,
and I can't have sex with her because I literally don't have the energy to hardly breathe right now.
yeah, yeah,
Those are the hard things that come with it, the financial hardships. And that's why I say, I made a really contradicting post once saying bodybuilding is the hardest sport in the world. The actual intricacies of bodybuilding internally are not that difficult. The mental processing and balancing your life while you're getting ready for a show because of the lack of energy and potentially even the time, that's where bodybuilding gets hard. It has nothing to do with the actual sport itself, in my personal opinion.
yeah. I always say, I talk about it being a choice, and for me, it's always got to be that. Now, again, there is controversy sometimes around this, and I always say, if you're bodybuilding, you're in a privileged position to do that, and you are doing so by choice. And back to sort of the first cycle and a first prep, this type of talk, that actually I found myself thinking that I should have people congratulating me every day for doing my steps, doing my food and everything else. And I was on this sort of like, I looked almost down on people because I was in my own, like, it was tough the first one, right? And then I realized, oh, okay, this is a choice. And I try and get this message across, because it can become very negative if you have this type of attitude towards your first sort of prep.
Yeah. So when you're in your first prep, you get a sense of drive and a sense of blinders on. It's definitely blinders. It's the most blinded you'll probably ever be in life to other aspects of life on your first prep. And I've seen it time and time again. And that's why the post-show depression, especially on that first show, is really bad. And then you kind of cope with it better the more preps that you do, because you know what to expect. However, that first prep, I mean, it's like nothing else exists in this entire world besides you're getting your steps, and I never really felt the idolization factor where like I want to be put up on pedestal. People start putting you up on a pedestal, which is a terrible thing. I never want to be put up on a pedestal. I want to hear like, hey dude, you don't look good right here. Like, this is a weak point for you. Fix this, right? And then I'm gonna be like, oh yeah, let's fix this. But when people start like putting you up on a pedestal, like, oh my gosh, you look so great, and you're like, well, yeah, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. You should be doing it too. That's a terrible way of looking. Like,
For
that is
sure, sure.
and that's what you're kind of talking about. And there's a sense of discipline, and for me it was the sense of discipline factor that I loved. I knew I was doing something so disciplined that most people couldn't do. I was waking up at 4 a.m., sometimes 5 a.m. to do my cardio. I'd wake up and then I'd do a 2-hour commute into work every day. I'd work my normal day. I'd go back home, another hour and a half, 2-hour commute back home. I'd eat my meal. I'd go to the gym. I'd do my 2 hours at the gym. I'd do some cardio after the gym. I'd eat again, and then I'd sleep and wake up and repeat. People are like, how are you doing that? And that's what I loved about it. However, it's really the disciplinary factor, and you need to be very careful about putting your blinders on too heavily around the other aspects of your life, because you will lose a lot of things that mean a lot to you if you don't learn how to balance life. And balance is a ever ebb and flow. And the reason why it's called balance is because, well, if you sway one direction, then you lose the other direction. It's kind of like standing on like your foot and you're trying to build ankle stability. Well, you're going to be like a flamingo, but you're going to be going back and forth until you get really good at it, and you are pretty stable after you build up that intensity of how to balance life. And that's a talent, is how to balance life. But when you put into finances and you're going balls deep into finances, then you lose your relationship. Or if you go balls deep into your relationship, maybe you start losing finances. And it's this constant ebb and flow, and you need to find when your energy is being sucked and depleted dry, how you can balance instead of just blacking out the other areas of your life, because you will be very depressed coming out of the show because the things that meant something to you are no longer going to be there for you.
Yeah, your goal is removed, isn't it? And it's a fucking shell shock, that especially that first time, and even probably my first 2 or 3 preps. Like, I didn't place my first couple of seasons. I didn't really even get a look in. And, you know, I was natural. I had no sporting background. I wouldn't say my genetics are that good. You know, if I'm being objective. And I had to put work into the sport and have off seasons and what have you to be able to gain success. And it was hard, you know. The next day I'd do one show in a season, do 6 to 8 month prep or whatever, and then it was like, fuck. And then you're suddenly going into a growth phase. And what you described there, I think, again, it relates back to, so what David's just been through. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, I want to go assisted, I haven't really ever done a prep, but your idea is to go into a prep. If you hear this and go, fuck that, then you probably shouldn't look at the assisted route. You should try a prep first, right?
Yeah. So I prepped naturally my first time.
Yeah.
I had no clue what I was doing. I was in the summer, I was in college. It was the second or third year that Men's Physique was out. I was like 183 pounds at 5'8". So I was pretty big for like being on stage. I was eating, my prep was no joke. I got some guidance, and the guidance was eat 2 rotisserie chickens a day. And that's what I did for 2 weeks. And I
I
stepped on
love that.
stage. Dude, like literally like the worst advice someone could ever, yeah, eat 2 rotisserie chickens a day. You're going to be peeled, bro. I mean, I dropped body fat. I was like sitting there, like I was bouncing too. So I was like sitting there, like eating like the rotisserie chicken, like with my hands in the middle of the night, bouncing, drinking a gallon jug of water. Like, just like, that was my prep. And I mean, I think I was like second call outs or third call outs. There were a lot of guys back then. Like there were a lot of competitors. I think there were like 20-ish in my class at like a local show. And you know, I was definitely the biggest guy. I didn't get a look. I didn't know what I was doing posing wise. I did the what's that wipe on tan? It's not like, you know what I'm talking about. Like
Yeah,
in the Indians use it and you look gold, right? You look like a bronze statue. Dream tan. That's what it was. It's banned too. Like they don't, the
it is.
NPC doesn't even allow it.
Yeah.
And that's what I used for my first time. We just slapped on some dream tan and like I stepped on stage. Oh my gosh, that's a throwback. But you know, I enjoyed being on stage. I thought I was gonna hate being on stage. I was like, I want to get on stage just to see if I even like being on stage at all. And I didn't actually have stage fright. That was my biggest thing. Is I'm very introverted, even though I sound extroverted. I'm not. I know I put myself in a lot of uncomfortable situations to have conversations and connect with people.
Yeah.
And that was something I had to personally practice. That was a weak point for me. So yeah, I enjoyed it on stage. And then I was like, okay, cool. This is something I want to reconvene with when I'm not a broke college student later on.
Yeah.
And that was my first prep ever. And then after that, then I won the overall first classic show in Georgia. That was like 2 years after that.
And were you assisted for that?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. So I guess it would be quite cool to talk about a little bit about personal anecdote as to your journey through PEDs, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of that.
Yeah, sure. My first cycle ever was a terrible decision. It was a recommendation from the guy that was like, "Oh, everyone's on trend, by the way." So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
already know where this is going. So my first cycle was 250. Terrible cycle. Never, don't recommend this to anyone. And I felt like a freak of nature, and I actually didn't get side effects. So I just want to like reiterate that 250 milligrams of test per week, and it was 500 milligrams of tren. And I literally blew up. I felt good. I had the anxiety
Yeah.
because I had panic disorder actually at this time, which makes it even worse that it was tren that was involved. It was a
Yeah.
12-week cycle. No, maybe it was 10 weeks. It was 10 or 12 weeks. I can't remember. It's been such a long time ago now. Pretty sure 12 weeks. And that was the normal course of action that people took back then, was like 12-week cycles and off. Like 16-week cycles were very, very rare. It was either 10 weeks or 12 weeks. That was the number. And I think at like week 6 to 8 is when the anxiety hit me. And it was like a wiring, like a freak of nature wiring. And I was an adrenaline junkie, right? I was very mellow. So I never got roid rage, but I could tell like the sense of aggression was just through the roof. And it was the way I describe it was it's like a switch, a light switch, right? So it's always off for me. Like I'm very easygoing, but like I tell you what, like I could get triggered and that light switch could flip on very easily, and you could feel your brain and your eyes just light up. It was something different, like that would happen at a neurological level. Obviously, I know the science behind it now, but at a neurological level, the only way I could describe it is almost like shoot, you're taking like an amphetamine or a ton of caffeine, like it literally lights up your head like a light switch, and you're just like, you want to go? And I was a bouncer, so it was a terrible position. Now I was really easygoing, so I never hurt anyone when I bounced. I never threw fists or anything like that. I'd usually like, honestly, like full Nelson someone and drag them out the door kind of thing. I would talk to them first. I'll be like, look, like quit doing a little dick contest. Like you guys are out here to get laid. Quit being dicks to each other. Like have a good time and get laid, right? Like whatever. If that's what you guys are here to do, I don't know what you guys are here to do. So and then next thing you know, if they did something stupid, you just drag them out of the bar. So I had to be very, very cognizantly aware that the fact I was much more emotionally prone to that light switch flipping up. And I was really good at targeting that in the gym. And when I was in the gym, my strength was just through the roof. I will tell you right now, though, off cycle, I was always stronger than on cycle. And people are going to say I'm full of it. All my PRs I hit were off cycle. I was always stronger. I don't know if it's from like the fact that maybe my tendons and ligaments, I could monitor them a little bit better. I could feel them better because I was always strong more mentally than at a physical level, because I've blown out so many muscles and tendons and just about everything you can pretty much think of by this point. So that was, I think, one thing that contributed to me realizing that it wasn't as important to be on cycle, because you can train just as hard off cycle than on cycle, but it was more around hormonal stability than anything. The sex factor, this is the one big one, is you get horny. Now tren is definitely a more horny aggressiveness than other things. It actually, and I mean, this is way TMI for the audience, but I always had prolactin issues even when I was a child, and obviously tren directly affects prolactin and increases it. So when I was on, when you're having prolactin issues, it usually creates a numbness in your penis, or penis sensitivity reduces down. So when you implement tren, one, it makes you super horny. Any androgens in general make you hornier for the most part. And then when you're on tren, it increases the prolactin, so you get in even more numbness. So it was like you could just go forever, which was like a really weird feeling. And it was like, cool. There's like, I'm sitting in class, right? And you're like trying to study, and next thing you know, you're like, why do I have an erection right now? And that can happen as a male anyways. It's more of just like an annoying thing. You're like, all right, well, I'm never wearing jeans again because the friction kind of thing, right? Or a breeze rolls in. It's kind of like the Jizz in My Pants song. And like, that's basically what it was like. I was like, this is just like annoying. Can it like stop now?
Yeah.
So this is sex drive is something that drastically affects relationships. Now I was single at the time, and I really like didn't mess around like that. I really stayed in my own lane. I never wanted to be held back. And it was a lot of it had to do with my first relationship. It was not a good relationship. And I just kind of stayed in my lane, and I would study, I'd go to the gym, and I'd bounce. And like, so I worked my way through school. So that was probably the biggest change, was the mental psychology and that switch. And then the sex drive was absolutely absurd, and it can't be ever expressed until you actually experience it yourself, which I'm not recommending people to take anything just to be like, oh yeah, I'm horny. Like, no, because it can go the opposite way too. Like there are some convoluted events that can happen.
Yeah, actually, I really like how you said about the sort of connection with mental health. Now, this is definitely something, of course, with Tren. Matt, my other half, actually did a consult with someone, and he was sort of friends with him from back home and what have you. Anyway, this guy went to the gym, and the man that was advising him, he owns the gym or whatever, and he's done well in the sport. So he says, okay, so first cycle, we're going to put you on 400 test, 200 tren, 60 clen. Start that, jab it all on a Monday. This guy, bearing in mind, is deconditioned, just wanted to lose a little bit of weight, and he's not looking to compete, nothing. And Matt was voice noting him, right? And then he messaged Matt back saying, you're scaring me now. And he was like, I hope I am, because I need you to actually think about this. And this guy has got quite bad mental health already. And it was like, fuck, how is this happening, you know?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So my panic disorder, I believe, was developed from the emotional abuse in the first relationship that I personally experienced.
Yeah.
That's one reason why I really stayed in my lane when it came to like women. And also I was just never like that. Like I just was very driven, always was, and I didn't want to waste time. That was my biggest thing. And I also didn't have a lot of time to waste. So
Yeah.
the negative mental aspect that this stuff can have is really passed off as, oh, it's a side effect. It's called a side effect because it's something that you don't want. Technically, it's all effects, right? it's an effect that you want. You may want that psychoactive effect for like in the gym and those squats, right? That's actually probably the most beneficial thing about androgens is like when you're opening up those neurotransmitters and they're firing off at high rates and you just feel like a freak in the gym, which testosterone alone, by the way, you guys can have that effect as long as you allow it to, and you can hone that craft of like triggering your adrenaline before you're set, which breathing habits was actually probably the most beneficial thing I ever learned when it came to lifting weights. That drive factor you can use towards good or bad, but it's just like anything else in the world. Tren is the number one steroid I would recommend staying away from, unless if there is a very relative reason why you're taking it, such as you're a good bodybuilder stepping on stage. And it doesn't mean that you need to take it to look good on stage. Is it the probably most beneficial contributing steroid to looking a certain way on stage? I probably say yes. Now, I think the most important one in conjunction with testosterone would be a amasterone or Primabol, and hands down, that is the most, I think, the most useful anabolic androgenic steroid ever made. Those two right there. It has relative uses that aren't being utilized for them anymore, and it's more within the male populace that it could be utilized rather than a anti-aromatizer, right? An AI, like an estradiol or Arimidex, as people know it by. So those two alone, Test and Primo or Test and Masteron, can take you so far. And everyone's like, yeah, you have to take Tren. It's not true. Like, to get peeled, it's going to be a diet and cardio. And if you want to assist that fat burning process, maybe a little bit of clenbuterol or yohimbine. Tren can free up thyroid hormone, which is one of the major factors that can help there. But I mean, you could even do something more mild, like a small dose of Anavar, and free up some thyroid, like you reduce down your thyroid binding globulin, and then you get more thyroid hormone available. So if you look at the actual mechanisms of actions of these things, you can be much smarter about it. But if you are in a bad mental space, or you know that you're aggressive naturally, I would stay so far away from Tren. Like, that's not, like, it's not a joke. Like, that is one of the scariest compounds out there. And I hope this is scaring some people, because it's just not needed at a top level for a certain look. It is amazing compound to add into a bodybuilding prep. However, it is one of those ones that can go very ass backwards very quickly.
Yeah, my conversations with my coach, he said when he used it, like, because it's neurotoxic, isn't it? And people maybe don't realize that. And if they're not told that, and then suddenly, you know, my coach was saying what he was experiencing, he was pushing away his closest people to him, and maybe wasn't like actually realizing. And then he was like, I'm gonna come off it, and he came off it, and he was like, fucking it, like the difference, and I'm never going near it again, because to me the neurotoxicity is not worth the benefits of using something like Tren.
Yeah, all androgens to a degree are neurotoxic to some extent. Estrogen's going to be your only saving grace there, really. And then when you combine it with like stimulants or clenbuterol, that can cause expression of anxiety for sure, because you're affecting your resting heart rate. So if that's someone that has a high resting heart rate, and then you add something like a clenbuterol into the mix or a Tren into the mix, like it will increase your resting heart rate. In fact, there was one prep I came out of, and my resting heart rate I contributed to more Tren. I actually didn't use clenbuterol in the prep because I literally couldn't. I didn't realize my resting heart rate was so high when we tried to implement it, that it went the opposite direction. And I was like, dude, I'm like falling asleep. I feel terrible on it. Like, I can't function. And it should increase like your energy levels to a degree. And it was going the opposite direction every time. Well, sure enough, at the end of that prep, I took my resting heart rate, and my resting heart rate would not get below 100. Every single month, I was able to drop my resting heart rate by about 5 beats per minute. So this is no joke. I mean, this contributes to heart disease, heart attacks, everything. And you're living in a constant state of anxiety. You're not sleeping at nighttime. Most likely, it's very difficult to elevate your heart rate as well when you're doing your cardio. So it's hard to actually burn body fat. You're not going to have the energy to increase your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis in a day, such as walking, because you're not going to have the energy for it, because you're constantly pumping non-stop. Now, maybe you're burning extra calories because you're pumping that hard, but it's the performance side of it and the caloric burning side of it, where you're actually able to function in a day, goes out the window.
Yeah. And what Matt described to this guy as well was, so, you know, what are your goals? Okay, so you're deconditioned, you want to lose a bit of weight. And it was like, hold on a minute, let's try and get some nutrition and training under your belt first, because you haven't been to the gym for ages. And it was like, what, you know, where does this come from? And actually, from our first pod, I mentioned, because you touched on there a bit about Anavar, I had someone contact me about a coach that had said to her, right, 10 milligrams of Anavar per day for your first cycle. So that's obviously, we went through that example. And then 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks from the show, we're going to go up to 20 milligrams a day. And he wanted her to go on to 3.5 units of growth. And he said there is no side effects to Anavar or using that much growth. Maybe he needs to consider how much growth costs as well, of course. But this came off the back of our pod, and that's why I was keen to get you on again as well, because it sparked in her mind, actually, I'm being told to do that. Like, should I maybe question my coach?
Yeah.
Crazy.
So you should always ask questions. Like, if you're uncomfortable doing something, you should just tell your coach, like, hey, look, I'm not comfortable doing this, and this is why. Or B, have a conversation like, why are you having me doing this? Because I'm not sure if I'm comfortable. And they should be able to articulate why and what you could expect as side effects. Remember, effects and side effects. Like, if they're unwanted side effects, then sure, you should know what they are. Now, 3 IUs of GH is quite a bit for a female.
3.5.
Yeah, 3.5. Yeah, that's a lot for a female. Really, like, if you're doing it for more of the benefits out of like hair, skin, nails, and stuff like that, like 1 IU a day is plenty. You might even get some muscle hyperplasia out of that. And then 2 IUs a day would really be like really maximum that I'd really
Same.
consider, even with a female, in my personal opinion, because it's you're not a male. There's just you're going to utilize less. End of story. Like, less androgen receptor. You're really trying it for the androgen receptor capacity to improve it. Now the other piece to this is, sure, you can have some lipase released, right? So lipase is an enzyme that helps it. This is where growth hormone really comes into the equation in a prep, and it is very useful. Not really 4 weeks out from a show. You actually, usually pull it close to a show, because
Yeah.
some people just retain a ton of water. And she probably actually did put on a lot of weight from increasing the androgens and the growth hormone, because I find in relativity, it's about like 1 to 2, and it depends on the person, 1 to 2 IUs of growth hormone equals 1 to 2 pounds of water weight, is usually the formula that I see in relativity. Now, lipase is really interesting in the sense that lipase releases fat into your bloodstream. So you don't automatically burn body fat. You have to get the fat into the bloodstream, and then you can burn the body fat. So it's very, very effective for burning body fat. Also, people would contribute growth hormone usually to insulin resistance. Now, if you're taking large amounts of growth hormone, then it's probably going to have some insulin resistant factors. I personally never had insulin resistance factors, and I went up to 6 IUs a day. I was always very insulin sensitive, though. I will throw that out there. And that's without the utilization of insulin or stuff like that, way before that point in time. But I put an open post about it saying I wish I probably would have utilized it sooner, because the quantities of carbohydrates I would have to eat, and I always was on a lower fat diet, just because I didn't do well with fats on the digestion standpoint, and to save my pancreas more so than anything else. But I mean, I'd wake up with like sometimes a high 60, low 70 fasted blood glucose, even over 1,000 grams of carbs. I was just a freak like that. So yeah, I would have 8,000 calorie off seasons for sometimes 2 months, 2-3 months at a time, and sustain it.
Fuck.
So so that lipase, it doesn't take a lot of growth hormone to start releasing lipase into your system. And really what you're doing it for in a prep is not for the muscle hyperplasia. It's really for the sense of well-being, potentially better sleep, better energy, potentially, and then the release of lipase, which can allow you to get that fat into the bloodstream and then to burn that. And that takes like 2 to 4 hours to really start releasing enough fat into the bloodstream where you're really utilizing that. And no one's waking up. If you just tell someone, oh yeah, disrupt your sleep pattern to inject some growth hormone so that you can release lipase before you're doing your cardio, it's like, that's realistically going to cause more of a detriment than anything else. So, and it stays in your system for like 17 hours. So it depends on how you're spacing it too. You can only release so much IGF-1 through your system anyways in one time. And that's kind of my stance there, is like, I think like 1 to 2 IUs with a female is plenty. And anything above that is maybe around that amount, but like on a first time competitor, like no way. And then, do you even need growth hormone is the question at that point, like 4 weeks out from a show. And then on top of that, it's like first time competitor and first cycle, 20 milligrams of Anavar, say what is it, like, things just don't add up there in my personal opinion. Yeah,
And of course, the coach said there is no side effects, because she asked, "Is there should I be worried about like male pattern balding?" No, no, there's no side effects. And I was literally like, this is why I want to do the pods, of course, right? So people hear it and
sure.
they're like, okay, this is not right. But it does blow your mind that I always say, I said this to Austin once on one of our pods. I don't know how these coaches sleep at night. And he was like, they sleep really well. And I was like,
They don't
okay,
care. They
yeah.
sleep really well. They don't care. As
Mm,
long as they're getting results and they can post cool results on their page and get more clientele out of it, they don't care. Like
mm,
some do. Don't get me wrong. There are some really good coaches out there that genuinely care, but some of these people that are just like throwing out stuff like crazy PD protocols, yeah, they sleep perfectly fine at night. They're getting their results. They're posting their somehow. Some of them are considered some of the top guys in the world and stuff like that, and it just is what it is. And then some of them just like don't know any better, and they just like, this is what has been done in the past. This is what has worked. Let's keep rinsing and repeating instead of taking a step back to look at the situation to see if they could have done this better or utilized less to get the same results, if not even better results, and made the person feel better at the same time.
yeah,
So,
I actually wanted to touch on like minimal effective dose. I
yeah.
think this is sort of become in the awareness a little bit more that you're getting the most out of the least. Now, if we were sort of stripping it back to if someone came to you and said, I really want to go down the assisted route, I've done a prep, really like this, I want to see what my potential is. How would you sort of describe what minimal effective dose is? Probably be quite useful for people listening.
Yeah, so let's do it from my perspective. If I could have taken back time instead of taking that 250 milligram of test and 500 milligram trend, what would I have done? And I actually did post this publicly, ironically enough. John, I didn't know he followed my YouTube channel back then. I maybe had like 100 subscribers way back in the day on my YouTube channel, and I posted like how I would personally run my first cycle. And my first cycle is, first off, you would run labs. You'd see where your actual testosterone is as a
Lovely.
male. So I think it's really important. One, you get a snapshot in time before you ever touch anything. What's going on? I was broke. I was stupid. I didn't do that. Now, I would have loved to know where I started because I grew muscle tissue so easily. I think I had a second round of puberty around 19 years old, where I think my IGF-1 is through the roof, kind of like the one guy I told you about. And usually you see women actually running higher IGF-1 levels than males. So I think that guy was actually going through a second round of puberty, and he was probably hitting another growth spurt at like around 19 years old. And I suspect that's what happened with me. I didn't really get much taller. I may have grown like a quarter of an inch, if that. However, I got massive really quickly. I consider myself like, I would consider that massive because that's like almost 100 pounds. That's like 80, 90 pounds. Even if some of that was fat, a lot of it was muscle.
Yeah.
And I would have loved to run my labs. And if I had, let's say, a 500 to 600 nanogram per deciliter, most guys might at that age might have 600 to, well, I was older, obviously I wasn't 19 when I started, but maybe 600 to 700, right? So mathematically, if I'm going from that and I start taking 200 milligrams of test per week, well, now I just double my testosterone in my system. On top of that, I'm also releasing more estrogen into my system, meaning I can utilize, if I am producing still growth hormone at a decent sufficient rate, I'm increasing probably my IGF-1 that I have in my system. So that's where I would start. And I'd probably wait a little while and then I slowly titrate. I would definitely take more time on that cycle, and I'd only probably utilize testosterone. I'd keep some masteron on hand or primo on hand.
Mm,
It depends. Like if they don't have the money, I would definitely utilize masteron way over primo. I just
yeah.
think it's better utilization in this case.
Yeah.
And I would bump it maybe to 300 milligrams of testosterone at some point in time, and then you're probably around 2,000 nanogram per deciliter. Well, now you're almost 4 times what you were when you started.
Yeah.
And then maybe after another 4 weeks or so, if you're still tolerating it well and you don't have estrogenic side effects, again, side effects because as much estrogen until you can tolerate it. If you have no side effects, bump it to 350 to 400. And then that's probably where I would end. And you could probably get a solid like 16 to 20 weeks out of that and
Mm,
just grow. Then, because remember, we're talking about courses, not cycles.
yeah.
Am I going to be a professional bodybuilder? Am I going to continue doing this for the rest of my life? Okay, well, what is the most stable way to stabilize your hormones? Either you PCT and you come off because you're like, okay, I'm done. I'm doing this recreationally. That's it. Oh, by the way, if you had side effects, you would have leaned into a masterone instead of a testosterone there at the very end. After that, you would either PCT and come off. So I like HCG. I do actually like HMG, which no one really talks about, Clomid and Nolvadex as a male. And then the next step would be, okay, a good natural test booster I've seen work extremely efficiently, especially in younger males. A good testosterone, most testosterone boosters suck. So I've seen literally someone PCT off of it, a younger guy. I basically just had to fix him from another coach. And I was like, dude, let's fix your testicles is all that I said. Like, he didn't want to bodybuild anymore. He was ruined. Like he hated it. He like PTSD. So I actually got him to a 971 nanogram per deciliter 6 weeks after coming off, which is absolutely insane because technically like even that gear would have almost been like half-lifing out not too long before that. So he would have been really shut down. So, but there was a natural test booster in the mix. He was already done with his PCT and everything like that. So that was one of the craziest ones that I've seen. So natural test booster, I would highly recommend. And I'm not talking like just a Tribulus. Tribulus is so old school. It's like the 90s thoughts. So that's probably the course that I would take. Now, if you're planning to bodybuild, then you'd probably want to drop back down to either 100 to 150 milligram per week, really give your heart a break. You're not really going to have any negative side effects there. It's been proven that it can prevent heart disease potentially even at those dosages rather than being hypogonadalism. Taking a little step further, maybe if you tolerate it well, 200 milligrams per week. However, sometimes some guys actually feel better. I actually personally feel better a little bit lower. So I was at 200 milligrams for a very long time on TRT recently, and I ran my labs and I came back like over 2000 nanogram per deciliter. And I was actually only at 100. Like I forgot my two of my shots within the last 2 weeks before I did my numbers. So I was actually 100 milligrams per week for 2 weeks before I did my test, and I still came back over 2000 nanogram per deciliter. So, which is absolutely, from a mathematical standpoint, it's like, I don't know if I've ever seen it, maybe one other time. And I actually backed down my dose and I'm actually getting better results again, which is super weird. So I didn't have a negative impact on labs. I was just like sky high. And I was like, yeah, I was like, I don't need this much. I was like, back it back down. If I need more, I can always increase, kind of thing. I'm just doing my medical replacement therapy. So again, that could also be quality, right? From a compounding pharmacy versus underground.
Yeah.
So that's the decision that you have to run. Like, what is your end goal? Like, don't stop thinking short term. Like, oh yeah, I want to run a cycle to feel like a freak of nature, and then I'm going to come off and, well, by the way, I'm only going to do this for 12 weeks and completely shut down my testicles. Hopefully they restart again, because you might be waiting a year for them to restart. It doesn't matter what PCT you're running. So they're going to start when they're going to start. And you can do a lot of things to try to get them back online. But if you're genetically prone to being hypogonadism, well, guess what? That one small 10, 12-week cycle can make you hypogonadism straight up. That's it.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, as well, we could maybe talk about, so I don't know if it's like this over there, but in the UK, there's quite a, what's the best word? So injectables versus orals, right? Like a lot of females. I do have a lot of female listeners, of course, being the female bodybuilding podcast, but it is that whole thing around. Now, you spoke about not liking injecting. I'm exactly the same. Like before pinning, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. But then I got the education. I understood, of course, that this was the best route. But I think there is going to be a lot of people that listen that potentially are already using PDs and they won't use injectables because it's maybe dirty or worse, or
So okay, no one wants to inject themselves. Let's be honest. Like it hurts. It's a needle going in your body. Actually, some people don't feel it, and I'm like, I don't know how. Maybe I'm the most sensitive person ever, but like it doesn't feel good to me. So that being said, it's more of like a fear more than anything else. But I want to talk about the difference between orals and injectables, just straight off the rip.
I'd love that.
So the original oral steroids that were created, they couldn't get them to be bioavailable in the body. That was the history behind it. They were trying to make them orally available. They couldn't do it. So what they found out is on the 17 carbon, you can manipulate it and you can alkylate or methylate it. And sure enough, well, now it's going to sit in the liver long enough to where it can get metabolized and you can utilize it.
Mm-hmm.
Why is this important? One, you can now utilize that hormone. Two, it's now liver toxic. So oral steroids to some degree are liver toxic. Everything you put in your body gets processed by the liver at some point in time. Even if it bypasses the first pass of the liver, it eventually gets metabolized in the liver at some point in time. So injectables are technically less liver harsh because it's not going to hit it on a first pass. It's just like if you're talking about sublingual, technically it can bypass that first pass. So it's in theory less liver toxic than it would be if you took it orally. I'll have to do a post eventually about sublingual Anavar, and it's absolutely mind blowing. So, and it was only like on TRT plus sublingual Anavar, and it was from a compounding pharmacy. So it was pretty crazy stuff. Now, we'll get into that at another point in time, maybe on a conversation. So yeah. So when it comes to females, especially, there's a bad ideology around injection steroids. And why is this? One, because you think of the roid raging guy at the gym. That's one thing.
Yeah.
You don't know that it's less liver toxic than taking an oral steroid. That's another thing. So it's lack of knowledge. So now, what are some orals that you can lean into that are less liver toxic than others? Now, there's definitely a full spectrum chart of less liver toxic to more liver toxic. One of the less liver toxic ones is going to be Anavar. Now, is it liver toxic? Absolutely, it's liver toxic. Interestingly enough, it's one of the few that's metabolized in the kidneys as well as the liver, and that does not mean it's going to cause renal failure. If you're prone to renal failure, taking steroids is bad for your kidneys, and that's end of story. It will exacerbate any genetic defect that you potentially have underlying, and we're seeing people drop dead that have genetic components involved. The more you do, well, the more expression is there. So anabolics in general age us, period, end of story. There's no getting around that bush. Growth hormone and converting to IGF-1 increases cell proliferation. It ages us. Even though it might make us look younger, it ages us. So bodybuilding is quite the opposite of longevity. So risk versus reward is very real, and you have to understand that. Now, back to Anavar. So Anavar, effective dose. You were talking about effective dose. The effective dose of Anavar, quite realistically, is 2.5 milligrams. 2.5 milligrams can be very effective, maintainable for a long period of time without increasing an androgen load where you're having a ton of side effects. Probably takes a while to get to those side effects. 5 milligrams is an extremely effective dose for performance enhancement. Even 2.5 milligrams, you might see it. It's going to be probably very minimal. At 5 milligrams, you might notice a little bit of recovery improvement with the 2.5 milligram, maybe even less pain in your joints. So from a therapeutic dose, 2.5 milligrams is effective. It can be utilized even for, again, the joints. It's really good with collagen synthesis. And then the other thing that it's great for is recovery. So you're probably going to notice a very slight improvement in recovery. So what can you do? You can go to the gym more frequently. You can train more frequently. You're probably getting stronger because you're recovering quicker. Your volume is increasing. So the whole key to enhancing is recovery is faster. You can step foot in the gym more frequently. You can do more volume because you recovered and now you're stronger. So you're constantly pushing more volume. So think about it's still muscle growth, even in an enhanced world, is how fast the genetic component that people grow so fast is how fast can I recover? And there is a cap-out point to this, no matter if you're enhanced or not. So like you can only utilize so many androgens because we only have so many androgen receptors, and we can only increase the expression by so much in the density of that site. So you're recovering quicker, you're improving. 5 milligrams, you're probably going to notice a significant increase in recovery. And I'm talking like true dosing, right? These underground stuff, it's going to be underdosed. It's a very expensive raw. I have no clue the price. It's actually funny. I used to have an old school book, and it used to actually have all the prices of the raws, and I could only imagine how much they are now with like inflation and everything like that. I'd actually be really curious, like, okay, can you update this chart? I'm really curious because I'm not going to look it up. I have no clue where I'm going to find it. So either way, it's a very, very expensive raw. So usually it's underdosed or not accurately dosed, even if it might be overdosed, but that's going to be very uncommon. Now, 5 milligrams, you're probably going to notice a pretty significant increase. You're probably going to notice that like that neurotransmitter change that I was talking about, maybe sex drive increase. So this is where you're going to start getting more effects. Again, maybe some side effects involved. It just depends on you. Most likely not. but it would take some time to eventually get side effects, potentially male pattern balding, potentially loss of menstrual cycle on 5 milligrams. It's not maintainable forever, for sure. It's not like 2.5 milligrams where you can run that for quite a long time, I'm sure, without having any side effects. But at 2.5 milligrams, another thing is you can also free up more testosterone in your system. So the whole key is orals still downregulate your ovarian to pituitary axis way, the same way that even injectables would do. The question is where is that threshold? Everyone's going to be different. So the higher you go, the more it downregulates. But everyone has a resilientness to their axis way. When do you start reducing down your hormones? So when you start pulling down your testosterone, where is that catch-22 where now you're relying on the androgen from the anavar instead of your natural testosterone? But in very low dosages, if you're reducing down your sex hormone binding globulin, which helps to shuttle androgens, it actually binds androgens. So if you reduce down your sex hormone binding globulin, you increase the amount of androgens in your system, your free androgens, so testosterone, free testosterone. In low dosages, you're probably going to see a reduction in sex hormone binding globulin, and probably not much of a reduction down in your ovarian to pituitary axis. As this dose increases, you're going to see a reduction most likely in your testosterone, potentially your estrogen, potentially your progesterone, and maybe you lose your menstrual cycle. Again, everyone's completely different. Then so 5 milligrams, that bump, and then like 10 milligrams would probably be another bump. And 10 milligrams, you're going to notice side effects at some point in time. When you notice those side effects is very bio-individual, just like what I was talking about. There's resiliency involved. Male pattern balding is definitely a real thing that can happen. And the shorter the stint of time with the total androgen load, the lower the side effects and risk is involved. So androgen load over time.
Yeah, for sure. I've just started my next exposure and I didn't get on so well with Primo. We actually touched on this when we did the pod together. So this time I'm using Anavar 5 milligrams a day, and it's going to be for like 6 to 8 weeks. So like we call like an exposure or whatever. I quite like that term because it's like we're, putting a tool in, using a tool from the toolkit. And my plan is over a year, 2 exposures per year generally. So
sure.
And I've got on quite well so far. So I'm like a week in, feels good. I feel a little bit more before the gym. I feel quite hyped, but I've actually noticed my sex drive has gone up. And I mean, it's not a problem anyway, but it's like, oh, I just feel that. And as a female, it's quite a weird sensation. I don't know. It's not something I've felt before.
Yeah, that's literally the most common one that you'll hear when it comes to Anavar is, I mean, just androgens in general. Like, I mean, your sex drive just goes up. With men, it's a little bit different with testosterone. Like some people just like don't get much of a sex drive increase, unless if it's like bottomed out and you get testosterone and you're like, oh, I don't feel like a woman anymore, right? Like,
fucking hell.
Yeah. So with Anavar, the sex drive is a very real thing. I mean, like women get very horny when adding androgens in the system, especially if you have lower androgens naturally on the testosterone side. Just like a male that has low, again, hypogonadism male, you add some testosterone, or just let's say androgens into the mix. Well, next thing you know, they're really horny. Yeah. You take a woman that doesn't have a lot of testosterone in their system and you add some androgens in the mix and they get really horny. It makes you more like a man. You metabolize your cortisol differently. You start thinking more masculinized, and that's just the way it is. And that's what makes women and men very different, at least hormones. There are obviously other things involved, but that's from just a mental perspective and how we take actions in our day in the life. That is a major component.
Yeah. And this actually feeds into something I wanted to talk to you about. I mentioned it at the start, communicating with those around you. So if you are going to go down this route and you're going to start using PEDs, if we sort of hypothetically spoke about a partnership of someone that's going to do this and their partner's not into bodybuilding at all, right? So you're on this solo quest. I want to be a bodybuilder. Going to use steroids, gear, whatever you want to call them. How do I sit down and tell my wife or my husband this is, I mean, I don't know how you go about that if they've got no idea, and it could be quite tricky.
Yeah. So I was on my first cycle, I was single. I wasn't dating anyone, so I didn't have to tell anyone. Well, actually, I wasn't talking to anyone. So I like this way TMI again. This podcast is going to know way too much about me.
I like
so I lost my I was from Virginia when I was like almost 19 years old, to the girl that I dated that would like emotionally abuse me for like 2 years. I didn't get with anyone after that. And then we ended up getting back together or started talking again. And I split it off on the second time. She split it off the first time, which was a godsend. And then I realized why we broke up originally. And that's why I split it off the second time. And I was actually on my first cycle. I can't even remember how old I was, but I was on my first cycle. And I straight up said, I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about taking some gear, by the way. Well, I said steroids. She didn't know what gear was. And I don't even think I knew what gear was. I don't even know that term. I knew that terminology back then. So she's like, why? You look great. Because like, she didn't see me for I didn't see her for like half a year or something like that. And then all of a sudden, like she invited me over for dinner, of course, dinner, right? Like food.
Why not?
She wanted to make a move on me. And I was like, nah, I'm good. Like I came for the food. Appreciate it. And I walked out the door.
Do you have
So
chicken?
it was chicken. Yeah, it actually was chicken. We were in college and broke. Of course it was chicken. And yeah, like I did bring it up and she's like, wow, you look great, blah, blah. And I was already like maybe 4 weeks in or 5 weeks in at that point. And I was getting big fast. Like I told you, I put on 35 to 40 pounds or so on my first cycle. And I was like, okay, whatever. Well, I try to have the conversation. I didn't even bring it up in conversation anymore. I was like, whatever. So she was very opposed to it. Obviously I was young and younger than I should have been. And then that was that one. So then the other times I was single, but by that point, if I ever talked to someone, which would, I mean, I hardly even talked to anyone. Maybe there's one person in time. And like, it was so obvious that I was on like cycled up by that point in my life. I wasn't on TRT though, but I would like run a cycle and come off and stuff like that. But it was so obvious that I was on steroids by that point that I just like said it openly and I was just yeah, whatever. But I was like, it is what it is. I mean, if you're going to judge me, you're going to judge me. I can always walk away anyways, but I wasn't like technically dating that person officially. It was just like we were talking and I maybe only told one person out of the group because they actually knew about bodybuilding and stuff like that. A non-bodybuilder and having that conversation is a little bit more complex of a situation. And it also depends on like what the relationship is. If you're married to the person, you better be transparent because that's the easiest way to get a divorce is when you're not transparent communicating. I think you guys need to sit down and have a conversation. Look, I'm about to start this. These are some of the side effects from it. I had the genetics to be a pro bodybuilder. I want to take this to the next level, whatever it is. And have a very real conversation. And you also need to myth bust, right? For instance, like women are very scared if they know the sport of their men taking tren because of the side effects. Why? Because you guys are taking way too much first off. So that's rule number one. Stop taking too much. That's the first thing is stop taking too much. Get the right guidance beforehand. And two, come to a compromise and help them understand or send them a resource like a YouTube video. Send them my YouTube channel. I don't really care.
No,
where I'm very open and honest and I talk about the actual science of why it makes people crazy. But there are ways to counteract some of those side effects, right? And the number one way is reducing down the dose. However, tren, again, I'm very strong in my stance that I don't believe it should be touched ever in an off season. It's just not worth it. You're doing it for the muscle protein synthesis and the recovery factor anyways. The only real benefit that you're going to get from it maybe in the off season is it was always like more of like a potential energy factor and a thyroid increase factor. So maybe a metabolic increase, but there are ways to obtain that in other ways without having to get the unwanted side effects from it. And potentially like blowing your load early on where you're getting these unwanted side effects way too early on into the cycle and you're having to pull it or it affects your labs really heavily. Now, again, there's also convoluted information around labs, right? So some people do really well with certain androgens where it doesn't impact their labs that much. And then other people, it like blows out your labs. Like everyone's like testosterone is, and Broderick and I were actually talking about this, testosterone impacts your labs less than other androgens. And that's not necessarily true. There is a threshold and it's actually a relatively low threshold for most people. Mine's a really high threshold, but I've run 600 milligrams and it not impact my lipid profile at all. And I did an experiment with only testosterone, right? And maybe that happened because the estrogen was elevated. I don't know. It was in a good spot, like ratio wise, but maybe that was one of the reasons. Either way, most guys are like 200 to 300 milligrams before their labs immediately get impacted. And it's a 25% flip where your HDL, so your good cholesterol, goes down 25%. Women are the same way though. It will go down 25%, and then your LDL will go up 25%. It's literally like a flip of a switch. And as soon as you hit that threshold, it's like, boom, done. So in theory, utilizing the androgens for the actual mechanics that you're trying to get out of them is probably the smartest way to look at androgens anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's such a, like, even from listening to this pod, I hope that people understand that there is so much to it. And this is what I spoke to you about this before. Like, this is what I, before going down this route, got my own education from people that I trusted in the industry, and, you know, researched it all, even the cost, etc. And then I was like, right, I really want to progress my physique. I really want to continue being a bodybuilder. I'm going to go down this route. But even listening to this, surely, you know, if someone is considering this, they would go, okay, there's a lot more to it. And I think that getting this across is very important, and actually that transparency that we both offer.
Hopefully. I mean, I'm pretty honest about I just talked about my first cycle being 500 milligrams of tren. So I have like no reason, nothing to hide at this point. I'm super retired also. And I'm speaking from personal experience. I'm speaking from experience in watching just people around me ruin their own lives using stuff. Like, I've seen people ruin their lives. On top of this, like you talked about the cost. I think the cost is super interesting. The cost of food is much higher than the cost of androgens. I think that's one thing that people need to understand. Unless you're getting ripped a new one, which a lot of people do, I'm sure.
They're like, oh shit.
Yeah, they're like, oh gosh, I better. I'm way overcharged. Either way, the cost that comes into the equation is definitely also, from a financial perspective, something that needs to be talked about, especially if you're dabbling into or jumping into growth hormone. Growth hormone is where it gets expensive. The other stuff is relatively cheap, actually, which I tell people that people used to always come at me with like, oh yeah, it's so expensive. And I'm like, look, like, it's really not. Like, I'm getting compounded testosterone for dirt cheap. In fact, it's cheaper than I used to get it underground, and the HCG is also equivalent price to my underground prices, getting it from a compounded pharmacy, like scripted to me. So talk about everything. Like, if you don't communicate in a relationship, your relationship will fail. End of story. If you don't have the education needed for having the conversation, point them in a direction to where you can sit down with them and listen to it, and then you can explain things. I was very well educated before I met my now wife, so I could explain it to her. And actually, I wasn't actually on a cycle when we first started dating. I just did nationals in 2016. I came off. It was pretty rough to actually restart. That was the first time I ever had an experience like where like my testicles were not coming online very well. And I decided that after the next show, I was actually going to be on testosterone replacement therapy. On top of this, you have to take into account fertility. Look, if you're genetically predisposed to being sterile, I think it's almost a 1 in 10 chance that a male can be sterile. It's a very important conversation to have, because I've also seen people straight up get divorced because they can't have babies.
Yeah.
I've seen very, very well-off people get divorced, very happily married, get divorced because they can't have babies. So you need to take into account fertility as well, and be weaponized with the right knowledge to make sure that you can keep your testicles healthy, your ovaries healthy. These are all very important things, because these all get drastically impacted when implementing exogenous hormones.
Yeah, actually, when you spoke about tren as well, I think one of the other things that females think if their partner's going to take tren is that they're going to potentially stray or, you know, sleep with other people because their sex drive is so high, and that's worth a communication, right?
Yeah, that's a good one. I actually didn't think about that. I guess my brain doesn't go that way because it's just like
Yeah,
not my thing.
I'm not.
So
Yeah, for me,
yeah,
it's not
but for sure. I mean, if you look at the bodybuilding, it's so weird being in the bodybuilding community. Like,
no.
people tend to get around, and a part of the reason is the hormones, most likely, and the sex drive. And also, people in the bodybuilding community, let's be honest, like most of us like look pretty good for the most part. Like we at least have good physiques. I don't know if we're all like supermodels or anything like that, but for the most part we have good physiques. We take care of ourselves physically, and then there's also exogenous hormones involved, so our sex drives are higher, and that could be something that very highly contributes to that. So that's a really good point that you brought up. I just don't really think like that, but that's a very real thing.
Yeah, you could. I'd imagine, you know, if you were with someone, particularly if you're a female and the other half was a bodybuilder and you weren't, and then suddenly they're wanting to have sex all the time, and suddenly it's like that. What's going on? Why is it like this? And it would. I really like your idea there. Actually, sitting down and watching a YouTube video or something, and going, "This is what I'm going to do. This is, you know, what can potentially happen." Now, two other things I wanted to speak to you about before we wrap up. Now, what are your thoughts on SARMs?
SARM goblins are called SARM goblins for a reason. It's actually really funny because there's some people that are pretty prevalent that made a lot of money selling SARMs in the bodybuilding community. Now they shit talk SARMs. I'm like, you guys already made your money, and now you guys are all of a sudden shit talking. It's like, we knew. Like anyone with half a brain knew that this wasn't going to be the future. Maybe one had potential promising purposes involved, and it just really, I don't really see much utilization for SARMs. There's not enough research on it. There's not enough research that passed science to push it into the medical world for a very good reason. They thought it was going to be the answer. The side effects were almost identical to, or are identical to taking normal steroids anyways. It's modifying the androgen receptor. If you're taking SARMs, you're not natural. It is it's modifying the androgen receptor. That's all there is to it. And yeah, that's my thoughts on SARMs. It takes one of the major issues with SARMs is the threshold. It's very, 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 very selective to the tissue, which is great. That's kind of what you want. Now the issue is the threshold is so low that as soon as I don't know why I call it spillover, but I call it spillover when like it's not even like the tissue has already been bound to, and there's nowhere for it to bind to, and then you get all the same side effects as you do with steroids anyways. It still downregulates your hypothalamic pituitary axis way. I've seen testicles get shut down. I've seen it actually suppress men in general more than steroids have, like completely obliterate into hypogonadism ranges. Like I've seen in the teens actually in men, which is very rare, but
I mean, I've spoken about this story before on the pod. I remember when SARMs became popular in the UK, and I saw it on Predator Nutrition. I don't know if you have that over there, but it's like you can get protein powders and stuff. And I saw this thing, SARMs, fat burning, etc. And I was like, oh, you can get this stuff online. And it was like, and I'm glad you said it means it is still performance enhancing, because it was like, oh, can you take this as a natty then? Like, this is quite cool. You can get a bundle, you get it delivered to your house. Wow, this is great. And then I was like, actually, this is a load of shit.
yeah. And the only one really that I think is kind of interesting to me is not even a SARM. That's like MK677, which is basically, just layman's terms, increases your growth hormone production. There's major issues with it though, and the only real purpose that I see for it is increasing your ghrelin, so it makes you hungry, and it only makes you hungry for so long because insulin resistance is a very real thing. The inflammation from it can be a very real thing. So there's a lot of negatives and inflammatory markers that tend to go up with that one in particular, but it is relatively effective for increasing growth hormone production, but it's not more effective than growth hormone itself. So
yeah, for sure. And I think it'd be quite cool to wrap up on this. Actually, we have sort of touched on it, but how do you monitor your health when going down the assisted route? So another thing that would be useful for people looking at this route. So we've spoken about getting bloods, but things like blood pressure, maybe we could expand on that a little bit before we finish off today, David.
yeah, so let me just start off with this blanket statement, and I'm actually going to be doing a post on it.
Oh yeah.
The number one thing that's killing these bodybuilders are way too much weight on their bodies and then blood pressure. So monitoring blood pressure is going to be the number one thing that you do need to monitor. Make sure your kidneys are functioning well. Your kidneys and your heart are directly connected to each other in the sense that if one is not doing well, the other is not doing well. Whenever you're seeing edema and stuff like that, it's usually heart related, but it's probably kidney related, maybe not heart related, but it will put pressure on the heart nonetheless. So That's one thing, is blood pressure. Blood glucose is great to monitor, because when you start increasing your food to match your androgens, if you're doing it right, it can drastically affect your blood glucose levels. It can, technically they're anti-inflammatories for the most part, because their effects on the corticoid receptor, or basically cortisol effects, with it reducing down your cortisol level. So it actually reduces down your stress. So if you're not in a good spot when you start, it's going to make things worse. Yeah, exactly. So monitoring blood glucose is great, even if you're a natural athlete.
Yeah.
Monitoring inflammatory markers, monitoring your digestive system. If you can't eat and you can't metabolize your food properly, why are you taking something to improve muscle protein synthesis? What else can you monitor? For side effects, make sure that you're not having hair shedding. Hair shedding will not happen usually the first cycle, by the way. If it does, that's like really bad, by the way. Like, that's terrible. Like, you need to run labs ASAP. But usually what happens with hair shed over time, and this is like for men and women, is it slowly weakens the hair follicle. So it can take generations of hair follicles. It can take tons and tons of hair follicles as they're slowly getting damaged and weakened over time. And then next thing you know, you're balding, right? And it might be almost too late. Now, if the follicle is still there, you can save that follicle, but the follicle may be very weak. That keeps regrowing because it's been starved for nutrients for so long. Women, make sure that you're not in hypothyroidism ranges, because you can have hair shedding. Most commonly for women, it's not really actually androgenic alopecia, which is hair shedding down the scalp, like the middle of the scalp, the crown. Usually it's hypothyroidism, which is going to be hair shedding throughout the entire head. So that's just another thing that you need to take into equation. I think that kind of covers a lot of it. I would definitely run labs before. I would get a snapshot of labs during, just so you can see what's actually going on, how your body's actually responding on an actual lab work level, to see if maybe it's expressing gene expressions that you didn't know you had, and you can pick it up on labs. Now, it's not 100% that it's going to pick up on that stuff, but it's good to get the snapshot in time. I think that kind of covers the majority of it.
Yeah.
Sex drive is a good one too, for sure. Like, is it improving your sex drive, or is it reducing down your sex drive? There's two different ways it can go.
Yeah, my coach is very good with this, actually. He said each week at the moment, because we've been working together for a while and I've been in the sport for a while, he's like, this has turned into like almost like a mindset call every week, because he's like, how are you feeling? And then, because I'm on the Anavar now, how's your sex drive? And we talk about mood and all of these things. And of course, you can look at sleep and what have you, but that open dialogue with your coach or your partner, if you can, would be super, super cool. So I think that wraps it up nicely today, David. I love our pods. Thank you so much for coming on again.
No, thanks for having me on again.
The new John Meadows.
Oh gosh. Hopefully I had to earn that. I still need to earn my that slot.
Yeah, what a guy. And you are the same. Thank you so, so much. I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.